Although the restrictions are coming to an end, COVID is not.
She had to suffer on her own in the hospital.
Saskatchewan now forced to send ICU patients to Ontario.
It is a huge privilege to do the work that we do.
751 unmarked graves discovered at the Cowessess First Nations residential school site.
It's time that these secrets are revealed.
Folks do want to share their stories. They just need to be asked.
Half of our cow herd is just going to disappear with the drought that we're in.
You can't help but feel like a failure, even though you can't make it rain.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Sam McKegg. 2021 has been a remarkable year. COVID-19 may have dominated the headlines, but there were so many other significant stories, people, and moments. Our team of journalists has worked hard and overcome many challenges to bring you those stories. And over the next half hour, our reporters will reflect on the year it's been.
For me, the most memorable moment happened back in January, so it was right when the year started, and it involved a carbon monoxide leak at a Saskatoon apartment building. The drama started just around supper time last night. That's when a resident in this building went to Royal University Hospital's emergency room. Luckily for the 50 people in the building, the emergency room doctor went with his instincts. Dr. Mark Waba suspected carbon monoxide poisoning. And rather than just blow off the symptoms as being the flu or something innocuous, he thought, we've got to check this out.
A close friend of mine, she lost her brother and sister about 27 years ago to carbon monoxide poisoning. It's a silent killer. It's not exciting. It doesn't get any attention. It's tasteless, odorless.
And he sent the fire department and police to the building at 11 at night when everyone was going to bed, and found out that they were all getting gassed, and the building was evacuated, and he saved the lives of at least 30 people. It was an astonishing act of doing your job.
We have hit 751 unmarked graves.
751 unmarked graves discovered at the Cowessess First Nations residential school site east of Regina.
I think when I look back on the year and I think about all the stories that I covered, one of the most significant would be when I went to Muskowgan First Nation back in June. And that was when the federal government had announced that it was giving millions of dollars to Saskatchewan First Nations to begin the ground searches. According to the FSIN, a number of Indigenous communities are already set to begin these searches with ground-penetrating radar as early as this summer, including here at Saskatchewan's last standing residential school.
It's time that these secrets are revealed.
In a first for Saskatchewan, the wider public has been invited to witness the search in real time. The 6 First Nations involved say they want to turn a new page in Canada's residential school history.
Getting to hear firsthand from one of the survivors of the school talking about the injustices that were committed there was just really powerful.
I miss my mom hugs.
I was very thankful and privileged to be there.
It made me pause to think, not only as a journalist and the storytelling that needs to be done here, but also as a Canadian and what our country's history with Indigenous people really looks like.
It's an important story to tell, and I've been honored enough to be invited to help cover that story.
And its legacy is full of trauma.
I'm a bit nervous, and it's really overwhelming.
Officials say this is just the beginning and that there is still so much more that needs to be done. This is just the first step in finding out answers about the children who never came home.
The most significant story that I covered this year were the revelations about the Catholic Church's failure to compensate residential school survivors. Through our investigation, we were able to show that there were a number of questions and inaccuracies with the Church's claims that they provided $79 million in compensation to survivors. The Catholic Church claims it provided $28 million worth of in-kind compensation to residential school survivors, but has repeatedly refused to say what that meant. CBC News has obtained an internal list of those Catholic claims. It includes support for drop-in centers or Indigenous student scholarships. But there are also millions in spending for things like sending nuns and priests to northern communities or for Bible study groups.
It does appear to be some, well, to put it politely, some creative accounting.
And in a separate court case last week in Saskatchewan, the CBC and the Globe and Mail succeeded in obtaining other files detailing the Catholic Church's 2 other promises to survivors. People like survivor AJ Felix of the Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation told me there can be no reconciliation without truth. And I'm happy that we were able to contribute to that.
This year, the most significant non-COVID story I covered for TV was the drought in Western Canada, particularly in Saskatchewan. It was absolutely devastating. I spoke to ranchers, to farmers all across the province.
We've got a crop failure on our hands right now.
Anxiety, depression, and stress are rampant among Canadian farmers.
Half of our cow herd is just going to disappear with the drought that we're in.
People lost a lot of money, a lot of their investments in that drought.
This is our barley crop. It should all be this lush color of green, and it's you can see it's yellow and dead.
I remember particularly speaking to this farmer near Corrobert, and he was crying because he had done everything he could to grow his crop, but unfortunately Mother Nature wasn't there to help him.
I feel like I did everything I could, and you can't help but feel like a failure, even though you couldn't have done anything different. You can't make it rain.
The pain, frankly, of losing his entire crop for the year was palpable.
Charlene Graham's sister knew she was in danger. The 34-year-old teacher had just left her abusive husband, Delane Graham, and he was threatening her.
One of the significant stories that I covered this year was the murder-suicide of Charlene Obichon Graham in late August in Meadow Lake. She was shot and killed by her estranged husband, who then turned the gun on himself. And her sister, Della Duquette, had rushed to the scene to try to save her sister's life, but she wasn't able to.
She'll never forget Charlene's dying words.
Go, sis. It's okay, I'm gonna die. And then he came with the gun. She knew he had it, and he shot her right in front of me.
It was significant because Charlene was a beautiful, young mother and teacher who was killed by her husband. And that intimate partner homicide and domestic violence just happens too often in Saskatchewan. Charlene was leaving her husband at the time, and we know that's a difficult and dangerous time for women. And I just think that more attention and resources needs to be put to making it easier and safer for those women to do so.
Premier Scott Moe and Dr. Sakam Shahab continue to stress the importance of vaccinations.
The government of Saskatchewan has been very patient. Possibly we have been too patient.
I think the biggest story of 2021 in Saskatchewan is the fourth wave of COVID-19. There was a stretch where the province, a long stretch where the province led the country in cases per capita and the death rates.
We have expanded our capacity almost to double the previous pre-pandemic capacity. So the situation is extremely dire.
We had to send patients to Ontario, which is unprecedented.
The most memorable moment in a story this year was when the president of the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency apologized to the Miller family in the delay in getting Ken Miller's body back. The 61-year-old COVID patient was sent out of province because of Saskatchewan's ICU crunch. Miller died on November 4th.
If there's somebody that's been delayed 5 days, I'll have to look into that.
And I do apologize for those delays. So
I remember this one moment when his son, Andrew, broke down in tears, recalling the last conversation they had with their father, where Ken apologized for not being vaccinated right before he was intubated.
He could barely talk, right? Because he could barely breathe. So he was struggling to just even to breathe, but he wanted to tell me that that he was so sorry and that he had no idea. And he repeated that over and over again.
The most memorable moment, I think, is the handshake between Dr. Sakam Shahab, the Chief Medical Health Officer for Saskatchewan, and the Premier, Premier Scott Moe.
Although the restrictions are coming to an end, COVID is not.
A lot of health officials and doctors blaming the fourth wave on the government's decision to remove those health restrictions in July. But I will remember that handshake with Dr. Shahab and Premier Moe as a bit of a symbol of one stage of the pandemic perhaps being over, but we didn't know what was coming after that.
We'll have more of what made headlines and a lasting impression after the break. Welcome back. As 2021 comes to a close, our journalists here at CBC Saskatchewan are reflecting on the year it's been.
So for me, the most significant non-COVID story I covered this year was the story of Carrie Barassa and her claims to Indigenous ancestry. So for years, Barassa, who's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, told people that she was Métis, that she was Tlingit, that she was Anishinaabe.
I'm Anishinaabe Métis from Treaty 4 territory.
Barassa told the crowd she grew up in Regina's inner city, where she and her family suffered the effects of racism.
We grew up in a really poor, disrupted family, and that was due to intergenerational trauma.
But through my investigation, I found out there's actually no evidence of any of that. And once I reported that, people were furious that this woman who was very often speaking on behalf of Indigenous people was in fact not herself Indigenous.
It's embarrassing to think that we were so gullible and naive.
Also, since this story published, universities across the country have started developing policies and started having conversations about how to ensure that identity fraud doesn't happen, that people who are not Indigenous are not taking positions targeted for Indigenous people.
For me, the most significant non-COVID story that I covered would be the identification of Letitia John. She's a student who went to the Lebret Industrial School, and she died there. For me, it's the most significant story because she didn't have a name before.
Letitia John was memorialized by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation as Indian Girl 237. That number was found in a document among the National Center's archives. CBC News confirmed Letitia's real identity by working with White Bear First Nation.
When children died in the schools without their original name, it's hard to find out what happened to those children.
For me, it's memorable because the story wouldn't have happened without that confirmation, without the cooperation with the community, and it's just super meaningful to get that. Without a doubt, I'll always remember Letitia John. There was a lot of talk this year about residential schools and children who died at residential schools, and it's long past time to get them recognition. And she's sort of the epitome of that for me.
A moment I won't forget from 2021 was after RCMP Constable Shelby Patton was killed on duty. Police say that he was hit by a stolen truck during a traffic stop in Wolseley. And as his body was being returned to Wolseley, the community came out and lined the streets to support his colleagues and his family.
A small town shaken to its core stands in solidarity, all in red, to honor the final journey of Constable Shelby Patton's body, followed by his family and fellow officers.
And his parents spoke to me, their first time speaking publicly, and they described the nightmare, really, of losing your child.
You can have nightmares and worries, and you chalk it all off as you're just being a worried mom. But then it becomes truth, and you die a little.
And those words just struck me as a parent, because part of you would die if you lost a child. And those words, their grief, their calls for action, stay with me.
One of the things I won't soon forget as a reporter was covering the coroner's inquest into the death of Stephen Rigby. He was a young man in Saskatoon struggling with mental health issues and addictions.
Rigby was an alcoholic who suffered from depression and anxiety. 3 days before the shooting, a doctor committed Rigby against his will to a mental health facility. Staff there noted he had talked about provoking police to shoot him. The next day, a psychiatrist discharged Rigby. 48 hours later, Rigby was dead. Police said Rigby fired a gun and that officers who felt threatened fired their weapons.
And the moment I won't forget is the point in the inquest when video footage of Stephen being shot was shown in front of his sobbing family. I mean, that footage and the whole inquest really hammered home the incredibly difficult job that police officers have in these high-intensity situations, but also the incredible strength that is required of families going through these very public coroner's inquests.
A significant story I covered this year for TV would be how the new social assistance program, Saskatchewan Income Support Program, was indeed fueling homelessness in the province rather than solving it.
Living with 100 other vulnerable people in this temporary tent encampment.
Wintertime's coming here. It's going to get cold, 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 and we can't have people sleeping in these tents all winter.
Anti-poverty advocates say many people are living here because of the newly created Saskatchewan Income Support Program. It provides money for housing, but now gives it directly to people rather than landlords.
We're dealing with life and death matters here.
The day I went was the day the camp was getting dismantled, and it was really bittersweet.
The next stop for many, a new indoor emergency shelter, but not everyone staying at the camp was ready to go. Tim Bird is one of them. She says she felt a sense of community here, and she doesn't want to leave that behind.
We all became family. It really gave me an inside look at the power of community and what that means and how it takes different forms in different people's lives. And it also really made me realize in talking with people, so many people wanted to share their stories. They were just never asked. And everyone's story is so unique and powerful.
Welcome back. It's been quite a year. One moment I know I'll never forget is when Chief Medical Health Officer Dr. Sakam Shahab broke down in tears at a press conference. It happened in late October while he was begging people to do their part to stop the fourth wave.
I have no shame in pleading to the public that we've gone so far.
We're going to wrap up this special presentation with more people and moments from the pandemic.
I'm totally different now. I know I'm not who I used to be.
Steve Turnquist is constantly in excruciating pain and can barely walk.
It's a pain that is just agonizing and there all the time.
He was in excruciating pain when I interviewed him. He didn't know what was going to happen to him. He was hoping for a new hip. He was waiting for so long, and to receive a letter in the mail saying that he will have to wait even longer was completely devastating for him.
And if it doesn't get dealt with, I could lose my leg.
Maybe it was the fact that Jessica and I are the same age, or that it was the way she explained that I was almost in tears listening to her.
I think the person I'll remember the most, and frankly it'll be for a long time, is Jessica Bailey.
2021 started off as a year of hope for Jessica Bailey. This despite the fact that the 35-year-old has been battling kidney disease for 3 years.
Jessica Bailey is very young. She's only in her 30s and she has kidney disease, and she could pass away within the year. Jessica Bailey she actually had a donor, and she was waiting for the call with her surgery date the day that the Saskatchewan government suspended the donor program here.
Getting told,
oh, you're going to get your life back, and then it gets ripped out from underneath you.
She felt that her government had failed her. And just hearing that was really impactful because it switched from being a story I was working on to just something that was just so human and so hard not to connect with.
A person whose story will stay with me is Matthew Cardinal. In late March, he was in an ICU bed fighting for his life after he contracted COVID, and months later he still had to see a respirologist for his severely damaged lungs. And while he was doing that, he was working as a restaurant worker, facing verbal abuse and the threat of physical violence while trying to enforce Saskatchewan's proof of vaccination policy.
There's some people that throw tantrums and they get angry. And yesterday I was threatened to get punched out.
I will always be grateful for the frontline workers who are getting us through this pandemic, all while facing so much adversity.
I'll remember all the doctors, the health officials, the epidemiologists, the people that we leaned on to get expertise, to get answers on what was happening with the pandemic.
They're often working doctors or academics who are spending all of their time researching and trying to help understand COVID or dealing with patients, and I've been lucky enough to get time with them.
People may not know that we don't have access into hospitals, so we can't see how good things are and perhaps how bad things are, how people are dealing with it, how doctors are dealing with it. So we have to rely on the people that are inside.
I've seen them at some of their best of the times and some of the worst of times. You know, I've seen them after a full day of work for them, where they're obviously very tired, very exhausted. You know, they're stressed, but they've been willing to take 5, 10, 15 minutes just to explain some of the most basic things around COVID that I need to understand so I can explain it to our viewers and our audience.
I'll hold that with me as a memory from this year, as something that, you know, the media and the public I think really needed and depended on throughout a long portion of this year, specifically during the fourth wave when things got really bad here in Saskatchewan.
And despite the challenging times we're in, we are also constantly impressed by the strength and resilience of Saskatchewan people. Thank you for being with us.